I've only had my E46 for a few months now, but not long after picking it up, I decided to spend a bunch of time getting it caught up on neglected maintenance. I took care of items like the intake manifold gasket. I rebuilt the DISA valve. I replaced the upper and lower intake boots, replaced all the vacuum lines, replaced the belt, the two tensioners, the pulley, did the whole CCV system, and all sorts of other stuff. But even after all of that, I still had a bit of a consistent whine coming from the front of the engine. And this noise wasn't mechanical, it wasn't grinding, it wasn't whistling. It was sort of an electronic buzzing noise. I eventually identified that the noise was coming from the alternator, so I swapped in a brand new OEM Bosch unit. So the job itself to take the old one out and get this new one in is pretty straightforward, even though it looks like there's a lot of stuff in the way preventing you from getting access. So I'm going to show you how it's done and walk you through each of those steps. Here are the tools for the job. So first off, you'll need just a regular ratchet. We've got a 10, a 13, and a 16, as well as a few various extensions just to help you reach things where space might be a little tight. We've got a breaker bar in the back just to help with the tensioner removal and some of the tighter bolts. Up here for also that tensioner, we've got a T50 Torx bit, and to get the radiator fan off, if you have an electric fan, this is a T25 Torx. If you have a mechanical fan, we've got the tools to remove that here. And then other stuff that you'll need, just a small pair of pliers to pull off some intake pieces. At the end, you'll need a torque wrench to bolt everything back together, and then some optional stuff, some gloves and assorted lights just to help out with visibility. And for gloves, I really like these. They've got a nice textured coating versus just a regular plastic glove, and your hand doesn't get all sweaty and wet inside there. These are the parts for the job. So this is a brand new Bosch alternator, and I went ahead and also ordered some new bolts. So this is the upper and lower bolts for the alternator itself. And this particular unit is the 120 amp version. So there are two different versions for the E46. And before you order one, you want to go and check and see what kind of plug you have. So there's this plug, which is the standard square plug, and then there's another that kind of has an oval or round shape to it. This might be a little difficult to see, but you can usually do this inspection on yours to make sure you order the right one before you take anything off. So I'm just looking down next to the airbox and the manifold. Straight down, you'll see the plug. And in this case, we've got the nice little square plug. Right, before we do anything as far as touching the alternator, we need to take the battery out. And on most E46, that battery is back here in the trunk. It's a little bit of a pain to get to, but not too difficult. A few panels you just need to pop out, and you can kind of get to it right there. I like to take this plastic piece out just so I can get the connection clear out of the way. That way it doesn't actually fall back in place and touch anything. The other thing, once this is disconnected, I'm not going to close the trunk, because if I do, I can't get it back open. I'll have to crawl through the middle of the car to get to it. To gain access to the alternator, we're going to need to take a few bits off, and I'm going to start with taking off the airbox assembly. We just need to take off this front piece and the actual box itself where the filter sits. To get this front piece off, it's quite simple. They're just 3 little pins you need to pull up on. They'll come right out. They're little plastic pins. And once those are free, you can kind of wiggle this whole assembly free of the airbox. Okay, with this out of the way, we'll just set it aside, and then we'll move over to the box itself. There are 2 bolts right down here. They're 10mm bolts. I'm going to go ahead and knock those loose and set these aside. Then to get the rest of this out of the way, there are 2 little clamps or kind of springs on the front that attach the airbox to the actual intake. So you can take those off, and you can see I can get it start to loosen and it'll wiggle out of the way. The other thing I need to do at the bottom of it, kind of up front here, it's connected to an inlet tube. That needs to come off, and then this cabling is attached to it with a little rubber clamp. This can be kind of finicky to get off, but you just kind of wiggle it and push, it should pop free. With the airbox free and out of the way, the next thing we need to do is go ahead and remove this power steering pump. We don't actually have to disconnect any hoses. They're just 2 13mm bolts that hold it on to this bracket, and then we can lay it aside and get it out of the way. There we go. We'll go up and just kind of push it over to the side. We should still have plenty of room to get to the alternator and everything else that we need to, because the only two bolts we need to get to are here and down the front of it a little bit. So the next thing we need to do is make some room on the front. I'm going to take out the fan, and then we're going to disconnect that belt. So this E46 has a nice electric fan, so this is really easy to get out. All I need is a T25 torque screwdriver, and a little plier screwdriver to get this piece out. And then once I disconnect these electrical connectors, the whole thing will slide out. If you have a mechanical fan that threads onto the water pump, you'll need some tools like this to go ahead and take it out. And it's a little bit more of a fuss, but still pretty easy to get done. Take that thread piece out. Use a screwdriver just to pop this little plastic clip free. That's out. And then I'll go ahead and get these connectors off. There goes that one. That one pops free. So with those out of the way, I can go ahead and give this a little wiggle, gently pull it out and try not to knock anything loose. And there it goes. Now I have a ton of space to work up front, and the next thing we'll do is pop this off. We're almost to the point now where we can take the alternator out. There's just a few other things to finish up and get out of the way. The first is the belt. So there's just a small dust cover that sits in front of it. So I'm going to pop that off with a little screwdriver. And then we can relax this tensioner and create some slack in the belt and get it off. So there we go. That pops free. And let's get that loose. It's a T50 Torx. And I'm going to put it on the end of a breaker bar just so I can get enough leverage on it. And gently pull it clockwise. You'll see the tensioner move and that belt relax, and you can slide it out of the way and get it off the alternator. So normally there's another belt that sits in front of it, and if you're doing the full job, you take both off. But because we don't necessarily need to worry about that front one, I'm just taking the back belt off, and I'm going to let it hang slack. The other thing to consider too is that when you've got this off, it's a good time to inspect and replace some of these tensioners and pulleys themselves. So you've got a tensioner down at the bottom by the AC compressor. You've got the tensioner here for this assembly, and then the pulley that actually bolts to the alternator. With the belt free, we're going to go ahead and take off that top bolt, which connects to the pulley. And it's this one right here. So we have two bolts, one right here that runs to the top, another one's kind of hid on the bottom, and then we have the electrical connector, and then the actual bolt that kind of holds that power cable on. So this one, to get this off, is a 16mm socket. Again, I'm just going to use a breaker bar just to get extra leverage on it. Get that in place and pop it free. And then the rest of it, you can just thread it out by hand. And one other thing while you're working in this area too, it's also a good time to go ahead and inspect what's going on underneath the intake manifold. So there's a couple of areas that are prone to leaking on these M54 engines. One of those is the Vanos lines. You've got the oil filter housing gasket, which sits down here, and then also two plastic coolant lines that run underneath the manifold. Take a flashlight, peek around, make sure there are no fluids dripping, and see what's going on. So this is free. We can go and slide that out, get it out of the way. And I'm going to move on to the lower bolt, which is a little tucked behind that tensioner, but we can still get to it just fine. It is also a 16mm bolt. I'm just going to thread it out of the way for a second. We're not going to take it out completely because there's another step that we need to take when removing this lower bolt. But you can see I can kind of start to wiggle the alternator, so it's getting ready to come out. And like I said before, there's two pieces in the back here, just this electrical connector, and then we've got another bolt that holds the positive cable onto the back, and it's a 17mm. So this one you may have to kind of move the power steering pump out of the way. We'll knock that loose, and that's what it looks like. a little plastic covered bolt or nut. The reason I haven't taken out that bottom bolt of the alternator yet is that there's a little trick to get it free, or you need the bolt to help you move this little slider out of the way. So what happens is when you tighten that bolt on the bottom, this little metal piece moves forward and it locks the alternator in place. So if you just take the bolt out, that piece is going to be forward and it's going to be really hard to get it. So what you need to do is unthread that bolt a little bit. So kind of just back it out slightly. And then we're gently going to take a hammer, give it a few taps to help shimmy this piece back over, and then we can pop the alternator out. The bolt we're after is just the one right there, and you can see I've left it threaded out a little bit, and I'm just going to sneak a hammer in here and give it a few taps. And probably have to try it a few times, but just keep an eye on it, and you want to look for it to shift back. So tap it a few times, pull it out, see if you can get some extra clearance on the alternator itself. And when I'm doing this part, I like to put my hand in between the hammer and the radiator. So as I'm swinging it back, I don't hit the radiator itself. I just hit my hand because I don't want to damage anything here. So give it a few good knocks and see if we can get it out from there. Let's see if we can't wiggle it free. May have to do this a few times before you can actually get it out. After a bit of gentle wiggling and hammering, the alternator is now free. Here they are, old versus new. So dimensionally, they actually look a little different. So the housing here is a little bit smaller than this one. But if you line everything up, this pulley's in the same spot, and this itself is a little bit shorter. So everything should bolt right up, but you can see if we give each one a twist, this one a twist, it keeps spinning. Over here, give it a twist, and it stops fairly quickly. It's a little bit more resistance, just because these bearings are newer. So excited to put this one in and see if it takes care of those whining problems that I've been having, so we can have a nice quiet BMW again. I'm going to put the new alternator back in. Gently lower it and wiggle it onto that lower mount first. I'll slide the bolt in, and then once that's in place, then I can connect the vent that's on the back and get that other top bolt in place with the pulley. Got that lower bolt mostly threaded in. We'll put in the top one with the idler pulley. And the thing to keep in mind with this one is that the pulley has a small dimple on it. So you want to make sure you put it back in place that this lines up with the little notch that's on the front of the alternator housing. Get the ratchet on here, tighten these down a little bit, and then we'll torque them. Okay, for now they're just snug. I'm gonna grab my torque wrench. When I looked in the Bentley manual, the torque spec it had for this upper bolt was around 70 something Newton meters. But for this grade of bolt and its size, the maximum torque is 47. So there's some various resources online that say to torque it down to 45. So that's what I'm gonna go ahead and do. I'm gonna start with the one on top first, and then we'll torque that bottom one down. Now we can go and put the belt back on. I'm doing the belt before I connect anything back here, just in case, because when I put the belt on, I'm going to make sure everything's lined up and straight. So if it is, then we're good to go. We'll put everything else back together. If it's not, I'll double check some of the fitment here. Slip that back over, slowly release the tension, make sure everything's lined up and in place. With the belt back on, we can do a quick check just to make sure everything's lined up and true, and we can see that the pulley, the belt, and everything else is running nice in parallel. So I'm going to go ahead and put the plug back in, positive cable back in. We've got this little vent down here that I need to pop back on. And then from there, just a reversive removal. Put everything back in place. We'll do the fan, we'll do the air box, put the battery back on, and start it up and make sure everything works. One final inspection before we put the airbox back on. And that's job done. I'm going to connect the battery back up and see how she goes. Okay, here we go. The moment of truth. Voltage seems to be good. It's actually charging a little higher than it was before. It's around 14.0 before, now it's showing 14.3. So let's give it a minute to kind of warm up and let that idle calm down and see how it's looking. The old alternator is out, the new one's in, and I'm happy to report that things are running well. So the noise is gone. Charging actually seems to be a little bit better. It's charging higher than it was before. And now that this one's out and I can inspect it a little bit better, I'm actually quite happy I ended up replacing the whole thing versus just the voltage regulator. When I pulled this cover off, the regulator bushes were quite low, so it's good that's changed. But also there's a little bit of play in the bearings. So, you know, that may have been contributing to some of the noise I was hearing, but over time this thing is spinning at quite high RPMs, so it would have just probably gotten worse. So, job done. I'm happy with that, and hopefully this tutorial was helpful. Thanks for watching.